The young king of the Black Isles. You must know, sire, that my father was Mahmud, the king of this country, the Black Isles, so called from the four little mountains which were once islands, while the capital was the place where the great lake lies. My story will tell you about how these changes came about. My father died when he was 66, and I succeeded him. I married my cousin, who I loved tenderly, and thought she loved me too. But one afternoon, when I was half asleep and was being fanned by two of her maids, I heard one say to the other, "What a pity it is that our mistress no longer loves our master. I believe she would like to kill him if she could, for she is an enchantress." I soon found by watching that they were right, for when I mortally wounded a favourite slave of hers for a great crime, she begged that she might build a palace in the garden, where she wept and bewailed him for 2 years. At last I begged her to cease grieving for him, for although he could not speak or move, by her enchantments she just kept him alive. She turned upon me in a rage and said over me some magic words, and I instantly became as you see me now, half man and half marble. Then this wicked enchantress changed the capital, which was a populous and flourishing city, into the lake and desert plain you saw. The 4 fish of 4 colours which are in it are the different races who lived in the town. The 4 hills are the 4 islands which gave the name to my kingdom. All this the enchantress told me to add to my troubles. And this is not all. Every day she comes and beats me with a whip of buffalo hide. When the young king had finished his sad story, he burst once more into tears, and the sultan was much moved. "Tell me," he cried, "where is this wicked woman? And where is the miserable object of her affection, whom she just manages to keep alive?" "Where she lives I do not know," answered the unhappy prince, "but she goes every day at sunrise to see if the slave can yet speak to her after she has beaten me." "Unfortunate king," said the sultan, "I will do what I can to avenge you." So he consulted with the young king over the best way to bring this about, and they agreed their plan should be put into effect the next day. The sultan then rested, and the young king gave himself up to happy hopes of release. The next day the sultan rose and went to the palace in the garden where the slave was. He drew his sword and destroyed the little life that remained in him, and then threw the body down a well. He then lay down on the couch where the slave had been and waited for the enchantress. She went first to the young king, whom she beat with 100 blows. Then she came to the room where she thought her wounded slave was, but where the sultan really lay. She came near his couch and said, "Are you better today, my dear slave? Speak but one word to me." "How can I be better," answered the sultan, imitating the language of the Ethiopians, "when I can never sleep for the cries and groans of your husband?" "What joy to hear you speak," answered the queen. "Do you wish him to regain his proper shape?" "Yes," said the sultan. "Hasten to set him at liberty that I may no longer hear his cries." The queen went out at once, took a cup of water, and said over it some words that made it boil as if it were on fire. Then she threw it over the prince, who at once regained his own form. He was filled with joy, but the enchantress said, "Hasten away from this place and never come back, lest I kill you." So he hid himself to see the end of the sultan's plan. The enchantress went back to the Palace of Tears and said, "Now I have done what you wished." "What you have done," said the sultan, "is not enough to cure me. Every day at midnight all the people whom you have changed into fish lift their heads out of the lake and cry for vengeance. Go quickly and give them their proper shape." The enchantress hurried away and said some words over the lake. The fish then became men, women, and children, and the houses and shops were once more filled. The sultan's suite, who had encamped by the lake, were not a little astonished to see themselves in the middle of a large and beautiful town. As soon as she had disenchanted it, the queen went back to the palace. "Are you quite well now?" she asked. "Come near," said the sultan. "Nearer still." She obeyed. Then he sprang up, and with one blow of his sword he cut her into 2. Then he went to the prince. "Rejoice," he said, "your cruel enemy is dead." The prince thanked him again and again. "And now," said the Sultan, "I will go back to my capital, which I am glad to find is so near yours." "So near mine?" said the King of the Black Isles. "Do you know it is a whole year's journey from here? You came here in a few hours because it was enchanted, but I will accompany you on your journey." "It would give me much pleasure if you would escort me," said the Sultan, "and as I have no children, I will make you my heir." The Sultan and the Prince set out together, the Sultan laden with rich presents from the King of the Black Isles. The day after he reached the capital, the Sultan assembled his court and told them all that had befallen him, and how he intended to adopt the young king as his heir. Then he gave each man presents in proportion to his rank. As for the fisherman, as he was the first cause of the deliverance of the young prince, the Sultan gave him much money and made him and his family happy for the rest of their days. The 40 Thieves. In a town in Persia there dwelt two brothers, one named Kasim, the other Ali Baba. Kasim was married to a rich wife and lived in plenty, while Ali Baba had to maintain his wife and children by cutting wood in a neighbouring forest and selling it in the town. One day, when Ali Baba was in the forest, he saw a troop of men on horseback coming toward him in a cloud of dust. He was afraid they were robbers and climbed into a tree for safety. When they came up to him and dismounted, he counted 40 of them. They unbridled their horses and tied them to trees. The finest man among them, whom Ali Baba took to be their captain, went a little way among some bushes and said, "Open sesame," so plainly that Ali Baba heard him. A door opened in the rocks, and, having made the troop go in, he followed them, and then the door shut again of itself. They stayed some time inside, and Ali Baba, fearing they might come out and catch him, was forced to sit and wait patiently in the tree. At last the door opened again, and the 40 thieves came out. As the captain went in last, he came out first, and made them all pass him by. Then he closed the door, saying, "Shut, sesame." Every man bridled his horse, and they mounted. The captain put himself at their head, and they returned as they came. Then Ali Baba climbed down and went to the door concealed among the bushes, and said, "Open sesame," and it flew open. Ali Baba, who expected a dull, dismal place, was greatly surprised to find it large and well lighted, and hollowed by the hand of man in the form of a vault, which received the light from an opening in the ceiling. He saw rich bales of merchandise, silk stuffs, brocades, all piled together, gold and silver in heaps, and money in leather purses. He went in, and the door shut behind him. He did not look at the silver, but brought out as many bags of gold as he thought his asses, which were browsing outside, could carry, loaded them with bags, and hid it all with faggots. Using the words, "Shut sesame," he closed the door and went home. Then he drove his asses into the yard, shut the gates, carried the money bags to his wife, and emptied them out before her. He bade her keep the secret, and he would bury the gold. "Let me first measure it," said his wife. "I will borrow a measure of someone while you dig the hole." So she ran to the wife of Kasim and borrowed a measure. Knowing Ali Baba's poverty, the sister was curious to find out what sort of grain his wife wished to measure, and artfully put some suet at the bottom of the measure. Ali Baba's wife went home and set the measure on the heap of gold and filled it and emptied it often, to her great content. She then carried it back to her sister, without noticing that a piece of gold was sticking to it. Kasim's wife perceived it directly her back was turned. She grew very curious and said to Kasim when he came home, "Kasim, your brother is richer than you. He does not count his money, he measures it." He begged her to explain this riddle, which she did by showing him the piece of money and telling him where she had found it. Then Kasim grew so envious that he could not sleep, and he went to his brother in the morning before sunrise. "Ali Baba," he said, showing him the gold piece, "you pretend to be poor, yet you measure gold." By this Ali Baba perceived that through his wife's folly Kasim and his wife knew their secret, so he confessed all and offered Kasim a share. "That I expect," said Kasim, "but I must know where to find the treasure, Otherwise I will discover all, and you will lose all. Ali Baba, more out of kindness than fear, told him of the cave and the very words to use. Kasim left Ali Baba, meaning to be beforehand with him and get the treasure for himself. He rose early the next morning and set out with 10 mules loaded with great chests. He soon found the place and the door in the rock. He said, "Open sesame," and the door opened and shut behind him. He could have feasted his eyes all day on the treasures, but he now hastened to gather together as much of it as possible. But when he was ready to go, he could not remember what to say for thinking of his great riches. Instead of sesame, he said, "Open barley," and the door remained fast. He named several other sorts of grain, all but the right one, and the door still stuck fast. He was so frightened at the danger he was in that he had as much forgotten the word as if he had never heard it. About noon, the robbers returned to their cave and saw Kasim's mules roving about with great chests on their backs. This gave them the alarm. They drew their sabres and went to the door, which opened on their captains, saying, "Open sesame!" Kasim, who had heard the trampling of their horses' feet, resolved to sell his life dearly, so when the door opened he leaped out and threw the captain down. In vain, however, for the robbers with their sabres soon killed him. On entering the cave they saw all the bags laid ready, and could not imagine how anyone had got in without knowing their secret. They cut Kasim's body into 4 quarters and nailed them up inside the cave, in order to frighten anyone who should venture in, and went away in search of more treasure. As night grew on, Kasim's wife grew very uneasy, ran to her brother-in-law, and told him where her husband had gone. Ali Baba did his best to comfort her, and set out to the forest in search of Kasim. The first thing he saw on entering the cave was his dead brother. Full of horror, he put the body on one of his asses and bags of gold on the other 2, and covering all with faggots, returned home. He drove the 2 asses laden with gold into his own yard, and led the other to Kasim's house. The door was opened by the slave Morgiana, whom he knew to be both brave and cunning. Unloading the ass, he said to her, "This is the body of your master, who has been murdered, but whom we must bury as though he had died in his bed. I will speak with you again, but now tell your mistress I am come." The wife of Kasim, on learning the fate of her husband, broke out in cries and tears, but Ali Baba offered to take her to live with him and his wife if she would promise to keep his counsel and leave everything to Morgiana, whereupon she agreed and dried her eyes. Morgiana, meanwhile, sought an apothecary and asked him for some lozenges. "My poor master," she said, "can neither eat nor speak, and no one knows what his distemper is." She carried home the lozenges and returned the next day weeping, and asked for an essence only given to those who were about to die. Thus, in the evening, no one was surprised to hear the shrieks and cries of Kasim's wife and Morgiana, telling everyone that Kasim was dead. The next day Morgiana went to an old cobbler near the gates of the town, who opened his stall early, put a piece of gold in his hand, and bade him follow her with his needle and thread. Having bound his eyes with a handkerchief, she took him to the room where the body lay, pulled off the bandage, and bade him sew the quarters together, after which she covered his eyes again and led him home. Then they buried Kasim, and Morgiana, his slave, followed him to the grave, weeping and tearing her hair, while Kasim's wife stayed home, uttering lamentable cries. Next day she went to live with Ali Baba, who gave Kasim's shop to his eldest son. The 40 thieves, on their return to the cave, were much astonished to find Kasim's body gone, as well as some of their money bags. "We are certainly discovered," said the captain, "and shall be undone if we cannot find out who it is who knows our secret. 2 men must have known it. We have killed one. We now have to find the other. To this end, one of you who is bold and artful must go into the city dressed as a traveller, and discover whom we have killed, and whether men talk about the strange manner of his death. If the messenger fails, he must lose his life, lest we are betrayed." One of the thieves started up and offered to do this, and after the rest had highly commended him for his bravery, he disguised himself and happened to enter the town at daybreak, just by Baba Mustafa's stall. The thief bade him good day, saying, "Honest man, how can you possibly see to stitch at your age?" "Old as I am," replied the cobbler, "I have very good eyes, and you will believe me when I tell you I sewed a dead body together in a place where I had less light than I have now." The robber was overjoyed at his good fortune, and, giving the cobbler a piece of gold, desired to be shown the house where he had stitched up the dead body. At first Mustafa refused, saying that he had been blindfolded. But when the robber gave him another piece of gold, he began to think that he might remember the turnings if blindfolded as before. This means succeeded. The robber partly led him and was partly guided by him right in front of Kasim's house, the door of which the robber marked with a piece of chalk. Then, well pleased, he bade farewell to Baba Mustafa and returned to the forest. By and by, Morgiana, going out, saw the mark the robber had made, quickly guessed that some mischief was brewing, and, fetching a piece of white chalk, marked 2 or 3 doors on each side, without saying anything to her master or mistress. The thief, meanwhile, told his comrades of his discovery. The captain thanked him and bade him show him the house that he had marked. But when they came to it, they saw that 5 or 6 of the houses were chalked in the same manner. The guide was so confounded that he did not know which answer to make, and when they returned to the cave, he was at once beheaded for having failed. Another robber was dispatched, and, having won over Baba Mustafa, marked the house in red chalk. But Morgiana, being again too clever for them, the second messenger was also put to death. The captain now resolved to go himself, but, wiser than the others, he did not mark the house, but looked at it so closely he could not fail to remember it. He returned and ordered his men to go into the neighbouring villages and buy 19 mules and 38 leather jars, all empty except one that was full of oil. The captain put one of his men, fully armed, into each, rubbing the outsides of the jars with oil from the full vessel. Then the 19 mules were loaded with 37 robbers in jars and the jar of oil, and reached the town by dusk. The captain stopped his mules in front of the house and said to Ali Baba, who was sitting outside for coolness, "I have brought some oil from a distance to sell at tomorrow's market, but it is now so late that I don't know where to pass the night, unless you would do me the favour to take me in." Though Ali Baba had seen the captain of the robbers in the forest, he did not recognize him in the disguise of an oil merchant. He bade him welcome, opened his gates for the mules to enter, and went to Morgiana to bid her prepare a bed and supper for his guest. He brought the stranger into the hall, and after they had supped, went again to speak to Morgiana in the kitchen, while the captain went into the yard under pretence of seeing after his mules, but really to tell his men what to do. Beginning at the first jar and ending at the last, he said to each man, "As soon as I throw some stones from the window of the chamber where I lie, cut the jars open with your knives and come out, and I will be with you in a trice." He returned to the house, and Morgiana led him to his chamber. She then told Abdullah, her fellow slave, to set on the pot to make some broth for her master, who had gone to bed. Meanwhile, her lamp went out, and she had no more oil in the house. "Do not be uneasy," said Abdullah. "Go into the yard and take some out of one of those jars." Morgiana thanked him for his advice, took the oil pot, and went into the yard. When she came to the first jar, the robber inside softly said, "Is it time?" Any other slave but Morgiana, on finding a man in the jar instead of the oil she wanted, would have screamed and made a noise. But she, knowing the danger her master was in, bethought herself a plan and answered quietly, "Not yet, but presently." She went to all the jars, giving the same answer, till she came to the jar of oil. She now saw that her master, thinking to entertain an oil merchant, had let 38 robbers into his house. She filled her oil pot, went back into the kitchen, and, having lit her lamp, went again to the oil jar and filled a large kettle full of oil. When it boiled, she went and poured enough oil into every jar to stifle and kill the robber inside. When this brave deed was done, she went back into the kitchen, put out the fire and the lamp, and waited to see what would happen. In a quarter of an hour, the captain of the robbers awoke, got up, and opened the window. All seemed quiet, so he threw some pebbles down which hit the jars. He listened, and as none of his men seemed to stir, he grew uneasy and went down into the yard. On going to the first jar and saying, "Are you asleep?" he smelt the hot boiled oil and knew at once his plot to murder Ali Baba and his household had been discovered. He found all the gang were dead, and, missing the oil out of the last jar, became aware of the manner of their death. He then forced the lock of the door leading into the garden and, climbing over several walls, made his escape. Morgiana heard and saw all this, and, rejoicing at her success, went to bed and fell asleep. At daybreak, Ali Baba arose, and seeing the oil jars there still, asked why the merchant had not gone with his mules. Morgiana bade him look in the first jar and see if there was any oil. Seeing a man, he started back in terror. "Have no fear," said Morgiana, "the man cannot harm you, he is dead." Ali Baba, when he had recovered somewhat from his astonishment, asked what had become of the merchant. "Merchant," she said, "he is no more merchant than I am." And she told him the whole story, assuring him that it was a plot of the robbers of the forest, of whom only 3 were left, and that the white and red chalk marks had something to do with it. Ali Baba at once gave Morgiana her freedom, saying that he owed her his life. They then buried the bodies in Ali Baba's garden, while the mules were sold in the market by his slaves. The captain returned to his lonely cave, which seemed frightful to him without his lost companions, and firmly resolved to avenge them by killing Ali Baba. He dressed himself carefully and went into town, where he took lodgings at an inn. In the course of a great many journeys to the forest, he carried away many rich stuffs and many fine linens, and set up a shop opposite that of Ali Baba's son. He called himself Chogia Hassan, and as he was both civil and well-dressed, he soon made friends with Ali Baba's son, and through him with Ali Baba, whom he was continually asking to sup with him. Ali Baba, wishing to return his kindness, invited him into the house and received him smiling, thanking him for his kindness to his son. When the merchant was about to take his leave, Ali Baba stopped him, saying, "Where are you going, sir, in such haste? Will you not stay and sup with me?" The merchant refused, saying that he had a reason, and, on Ali Baba's asking him what it was, he replied, "It is, sir, that I cannot eat victuals that have any salt in them." "If that is all," said Ali Baba, "let me tell you that there will be no salt in either the meat or the bread that we eat tonight." He went to give this order to Morgiana, who was much surprised. "Who is this man," she said, "who eats no salt with his meat?" "He is an honest man, Morgiana," returned Ali Baba, "therefore do as I bid you." But she could not withstand a desire to see this strange man, so she helped Abdullah carry up the dishes, and saw in a moment that Chogia Hassan was the robber captain, and carried a dagger under his garment. "I am not surprised," she said to herself, "that this wicked man who intends to kill my master will eat no salt with him, but I will hinder his plans." She sent up the supper by Abdullah, while she made ready for one of the boldest acts that she could think of. When the dessert had been served, Chogia Hassan was left alone with Ali Baba and his son, whom he thought to make drunk and then murder them. Morgiana, meanwhile, put on a headdress like a dancing girl's, and clasped a girdle around her waist, from which hung a dagger with a silver hilt, and said to Abdullah, "Take your tabor, and let us go and divert our master and his guest." Abdullah took his tabor and played before Morgiana until they came to the door, where Abdullah stopped playing and Morgiana made a low curtsy. "Come in, Morgiana," said Ali Baba. "Let Chogia Hassan see what you can do." And turning to his guest, he said, "She is my housekeeper." Chogia Hassan was by no means pleased, for he feared that his chance of killing Ali Baba was gone for the present. But he pretended great eagerness to see Morgiana, and Abdullah began to play, and Morgiana began to dance. After she had performed several dances, she drew her dagger and made passes with it, sometimes pointing it at her own breast, sometimes at her master's, as if it was part of the dance. Suddenly, out of breath, she snatched the tabor from Abdullah with her left hand, and, holding the dagger in her right, held out the tabor to her master. Ali Baba and his son put a piece of gold into it, and Cogia, her son, seeing that she was coming to him, pulled out his purse to make her a present. But while she was putting his hand into it, Morgiana plunged the dagger into his heart. "Unhappy girl," cried Ali Baba and his son, "what have you done to ruin us?" "It was to preserve you, master, not to ruin you," answered Morgiana. "See here," opening the false merchant's garment and showing the dagger. "See what an enemy you have entertained. Remember, he would eat no salt with you. What more would you have? Look at him. He is both the false oil merchant and the captain of the 40 thieves." Ali Baba was so grateful to Morgiana for thus saving his life that he offered her to his son in marriage, who readily consented. And a few days after, the wedding was celebrated with great splendour. At the end of a year, Ali Baba, having heard nothing of the 2 remaining robbers, judged they were dead, and set out to the cave. The door opened on him saying, "Open sesame." He went in and saw that nobody had been there since the captain had left it. He brought away as much gold as he could carry and returned to town. He told his son the secret of the cave, which his son handed down in his turn, so that the children and grandchildren of Ali Baba were rich until the end of their lives. Oh. See you tomorrow night.